The neighborhood of Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado was quiet in the early hours of August 13th, 2018. It was the kind of suburban street where children rode bicycles in the afternoons and neighbors waved politely from driveways. Large houses lined the street, each one nearly identical, with neat lawns and white fences. It seemed like the kind of place where nothing terrible could ever happen. But before sunrise that Monday morning, something inside one of those houses had already gone terribly wrong. Inside the home at 2825 Saratoga Trail lived the Watts family. To anyone looking from the outside, they appeared to be the perfect American family. The father, Chris Watts, worked as an operator for an oil company. He was quiet, polite, and described by many neighbors as calm and reserved. His wife, Shanann Watts, was energetic, outgoing, and active on social media. She often shared videos of her life, showing moments with her two daughters, Bella and Celeste. The girls were young. Bella was 4 years old, and Celeste, whom everyone called Cece, was just 3. They were playful and bright, often appearing in their mother's videos, laughing or dancing around the house. Shanann was also pregnant with their 3rd child, a boy they planned to name Nico. From the outside, the Watts family looked happy, but behind the carefully curated images on social media, cracks had begun to form in the marriage. In the months leading up to August 2018, Chris Watts had started a secret relationship with a co-worker. The affair had changed him. Friends later said he had grown distant, emotionally detached, and increasingly withdrawn from his family. At the same time, Shanann had begun to sense that something was wrong. Text messages between her and friends revealed that she felt Chris was becoming cold and distant. She didn't know why, but she feared their marriage might be falling apart. Yet she still hoped things could improve. Just days before the tragedy, Shanann had returned from a business trip to Arizona. She arrived home late on the night of August 12th, dropped off by a friend who noticed nothing unusual. Shanann was exhausted but happy to be home with her family. What happened next inside that house would later shock the entire world. According to Chris Watts' later confession, an argument broke out between him and Shanann in the early hours of the morning. It was not the first argument they had had, but this one would become the last. Chris later claimed that the conversation turned emotional. Shanann confronted him about the distance between them. She suspected he no longer loved her. She was pregnant with his child, and the idea that their family might fall apart terrified her. But Chris had already made up his mind. At some point during the argument, he climbed onto the bed and placed his hands around Shanann's neck. She struggled, but she could not escape. Within minutes, Shanann Watts was dead. But the horror of that night was far from over. Chris later said that his daughters woke up after hearing the commotion. The 2 little girls, confused and frightened, walked into the room. They saw their mother lying motionless on the bed. Bella, the older child, reportedly asked her father what was wrong. Chris told them their mother was sick. Then he did something that investigators would later describe as almost unimaginable. He wrapped Shanann's body in a sheet and carried it downstairs. He loaded her into the back of his work truck. Then he placed his 2 daughters inside the truck as well. The 3 of them drove away from the house before sunrise. The destination was an oil site owned by the company where Chris worked. The drive took about 45 minutes. Inside the truck, the girls sat quietly in the back seat while their mother's body lay nearby. Bella and Cece likely did not understand what was happening. They trusted their father. When Chris arrived at the remote oil field, the sun was beginning to rise. The site was quiet, surrounded by empty land and large storage tanks used to hold crude oil. It was here that Chris Watts completed the horrific act that would define his name forever. He dug a shallow grave and buried Shanann's body. Then he turned to his daughters. According to his later confession, he killed them one by one. Bella, the older daughter, reportedly fought back and asked him a question that investigators said would haunt them forever. "Daddy, no." Those were among the last words she spoke. After killing the girls, Chris placed their small bodies inside 2 separate oil tanks. The openings to the tanks were barely large enough for their bodies to fit. When he finished, Chris left the site and drove back home. It was still early morning. Neighbors would later see him returning calmly to the house. To anyone watching, nothing seemed unusual. But only hours later, the truth would begin to unravel. That afternoon, Shanann's close friend, Nicole Atkinson, became worried. She had driven Shanann home from the airport the night before and had been expecting to hear from her that morning. But Shanann wasn't answering her phone. That was unusual. Shanann was pregnant and scheduled for a doctor's appointment that day. Missing it without explanation was completely out of character. Nicole decided to drive to the house to check on her. When she arrived, Shanann's car was still in the garage, but no one answered the door. The house was quiet. Nicole called Chris Watts, who told her Shanann had taken the girls to a friend's house, but Nicole didn't believe him. Something felt wrong. She contacted the police and requested a welfare check. Within minutes, officers arrived at the Watts home. Body camera footage captured the moment police knocked on the front door while Chris arrived to let them inside. Inside the house, investigators quickly noticed several things that didn't make sense. Shanann's purse was still in the kitchen. Her medications were still there. Her phone was found in the house. If she had left with the children, why would she leave all those things behind? Chris appeared calm as officers searched the house, but his behavior soon began raising suspicions. Later that day, detectives began questioning him more closely. Meanwhile, the case had already begun attracting media attention. A pregnant woman and 2 small children had vanished without explanation. The story spread quickly across news networks and social media. Chris Watts even gave a television interview outside his home. Standing in front of cameras, he asked for help finding his missing family. "If they're out there," he said, "please come back." But investigators watching the interview noticed something unusual. Chris appeared nervous, shifting his weight and speaking awkwardly. Experienced detectives often say that small behavioral clues can reveal more than words, and in Chris Watts' case, those clues were everywhere. The next day, detectives asked Chris to come in for a polygraph test. Polygraphs are not always admissible in court, but they are often used as investigative tools. Chris agreed. During the test, he was asked simple questions. Did you harm your wife? Do you know where Shanann is? Did you hurt your children? The result showed clear signs of deception. Chris had failed the test. When detectives confronted him with the results, his composure began to crumble. For hours, investigators pressed him for the truth. Eventually, Chris told a story. He claimed that Shanann had killed the girls after he told her he wanted a divorce. In his version of events, he had then killed Shanann in a moment of rage, but detectives were not convinced. They continued questioning him. Finally, Chris Watts broke down and confessed to the murders. He led investigators to the oil field where the bodies were hidden. When recovery teams arrived, the grim search began. Shanann's body was found buried in a shallow grave. Then investigators discovered the oil tanks. Retrieving the bodies of the children required draining the tanks and carefully searching inside. The recovery operation took hours. When the truth emerged, the reaction across the country was immediate. People were horrified. The story dominated national news. How could a father kill his pregnant wife and two small daughters? The case quickly became one of the most shocking family murder cases in modern American history. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to multiple life sentences without a possibility of parole. Today, he remains in prison, but even years later, the tragedy continues to haunt those who followed the case. Videos of Shanann and her daughters still exist online, showing moments of happiness before the tragedy. Friends and family continue to remember them not as victims of a horrific crime, but as loving people whose lives were taken far too soon. The house on Saratoga Trail still stands. To passing drivers, it may look like just another suburban home, but for those who know the story, it represents something much darker. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying crimes happen not in dark alleys or abandoned places, but inside ordinary homes, hidden behind closed doors.